Hi everyone. This will be a brief video on morality, religion, and the law. Let's start off with a couple of basics. First, it's worth noting that not everything that we have to make a choice about, not every decision we have to make, is a moral issue. Lots of our choices are non-moral. Typically, an issue is only moral. That is, a question is a moral question, as a rule of thumb, if it affects not only you, but other people as well. So moral issues are those issues that affect other people, as a rule of thumb, not just yourself. So for instance, personal preferences, like your favorite color, what kind of food you tend to prefer, these are, for the most part, non-moral issues to the extent that they don't have an impact on other people. Now, another thing I want to start off with is just to say, moral judgments have gotten sort of a bad rap in our society. It's often thought that to make judgment, to be judgmental, is a problem, and it's pejorative, that we shouldn't judge. And so people commonly say things like, "Oh, I don't judge," and they mean that in a positive way. And I take it the thought there is judging other people is the kind of thing that that puts them at a sort of in a situation of unease. We don't like to be judged. However, we are constantly in a position where we're expected to make judgments, whether it's hiring or firing, or choosing who we would like to be friends with, who we would like to associate with, who we want to be role models for ourselves. We're constantly making evaluations about other people, whether or not we want to spend time with them, in what capacity and in what ways. And part of thinking seriously about moral responsibility is taking ownership of the fact that we do make judgments, that we are evaluative creatures. One of the things that we do is to make judgments. Now, it's also worth noting, though, that making moral judgments isn't exclusively the domain of evaluating other people. Quite to the contrary. Most of our moral evaluations are probably about ourselves, and certainly should be about ourselves. Making a moral evaluation of another person serves a purpose in that it helps us to decide whether or not we want to associate with that person, or maybe if that person deserves some sort of punishment, praise. But for the most part, when we're making moral evaluations, what we're up to is we're trying to become better people. We look at our own behaviors, we look at our own choices, and we are in a position of determining whether we think they're good enough. Is what we're doing good enough, or could we do better, or should we do better? And so that kind of decision making is moral decision making. And it's the kind of decision that's aimed at ourselves. It's the kind of thing we'll be talking about in this class. We'll be talking about making judgments about whether or not our actions are adequate, whether they're good enough, whether we could do better, and if we should do better. What part of the aim of the class then is to decide in what ways are we not being as good as we could be for ourselves or to other people, and in what ways are we doing a good job. And this is part of the evaluative process of the class. And I also want to say that it's not quite enough to have just, well, we're doing good enough, we're not doing good enough, doing something morally right or not. That's a sort of narrow moral vocabulary. And so we want something that is broader. We want more nuance in a moral system than to just say right and wrong. Because there's lots of shades of gray in a moral account. It's not just black and white. Getting it right isn't just a black and white thing. So I've given you a five-part vocabulary at the bottom of this page. Think something could be, in addition to being right or wrong, we might think of things as morally required. That is, something is morally required if being a good person entails that you must do these things. So something morally required, commonly thought to be morally required, would be taking care of your children. Right? So if you don't feed your children, you've failed in a basic moral requirement. So it's not just the kind of thing that that you could choose to do or not. It's rather it's a moral requirement. Something that would be less serious, but also morally encouraged, would be helping your children to attend the best schools. And so it may be adequate to have your child attend whatever school they happen to be zoned for. But if you line up in a queue and go through the procedure and fill out the forms to try to get your child to the best school available, that's something that I think is encouraged. It's something we want people to do. But maybe it doesn't rise to the level of a requirement. It's not something that someone absolutely has to do, morally speaking. Rather, it's just something that it's good for them to do. That is, it's encouraged. On that same scale, something that isn't even encouraged, but is just permitted, might be having your child watch television. Right? It's not encouraged. Maybe it's not even discouraged. It has benefits and detriments. It's acceptable. It's an acceptable thing that factors sort of both directions. It's not something we would encourage. It's certainly not something that's required, but maybe it's something that's permitted of a parent. Something that would be discouraged, say in a parenting situation, might be feeding your child cookies and crackers on a regular basis, right? So if your child every day is eating most of their calories from, say, cookies and other fried starches, I'm going to say, okay, it's not the kind of thing that's absolutely prohibited, but it's certainly discouraged. Right? It's the kind of thing that, to be a good person, if you were trying to care for the best interests of a child, you would discourage that sort of behavior. And so, from a moral perspective, it's doing a disservice to the child. It's a discouraged behavior. And something morally prohibited on this same spectrum might be abusing your child, right? So beating your child, leaving welts on their arm as a form of punishment. It's morally prohibited behavior, the kind of thing that if you're doing this, you've done something morally wrong. So I offer those examples and this spectrum, not to say that this is exhaustive of the types of moral distinctions that we might make, but just to give you some kind of vocabulary beyond morally right and morally wrong. So we could have a 5-part distinction, say. Things that are required, ranging to things that are prohibited. Now, part of the class on ethics that I feel like it'd be remiss in not sharing is a general distinction between 3 main fields of ethics. Meta-ethics involves those questions that that are prefatory to, or that begin a systematic understanding of morality and moral thinking. So questions of meta-ethics are the ones that we'll address a couple of them in this video. These are questions about whether or not we should, whether or not ethics is really just a subset of the law or the same thing as the law, or whether or not ethics is just some part of religion, or whether there's any sense to be made of speaking about morality or ethics at all. And in this video, a little further along in this video, and then again on Saturday, we'll be talking about a couple of meta-ethical issues. A second sort of ethics, a second sort of inquiry that we might be doing here is called normative ethics. Normative ethics involves different systems for answering questions about how we ought to behave. That is, if you have a question about how you ought to behave, you have a diverging forks in the road and you want to know which action should I take, normative ethics provides multiple ways to decide. That is, if you're looking at a fork in the road, you want to know, how do I choose which path to take? Do I look at my compass, or do I look at my GPS system? Right? Maybe they give the same answer very often, but occasionally they give different answers. Likewise, with normative ethical theories, you get different systems for deciding which direction is the correct course of action to take in a given situation. The two main branches, that is, the two main styles of decision making here, are utilitarianism, which focuses on consequences, that is, the production of good results, and deontology, which focuses on principles, that is, upholding some moral principles independent of the consequences, such as treating other people with respect or dignity, or following our obligations, upholding our own responsibilities or duties. So those are the two most prominent ways of doing ethics. Those are the two most prominent normative ethical systems. One consequentialist, that is focusing on results, and one deontological, focusing on upholding moral principles. And again, very often they'll have the same answer about what to do in any given situation, but occasionally their answers will be different, and the ways that they arrive at those answers are substantially different. One focuses on consequence, the other on principles. And then the third main branch of ethics is practical ethics. And this is ethics about ethical reasoning about specific types of situation. So reasoning morally about speech acts. Think, for instance, of the Westboro Baptist Church protesting military funerals, or yelling fire in a crowded theater. Right? We want to address acts of those sorts to determine how morally responsible they are. Practical ethics addresses questions about poverty or healthcare or punishment, the types of things that arise in actual situations. So in practical ethics, what we're doing is we're using normative moral theories to address a range of actual situations or actual questions that come up in life. And that will be the second half of this course. We'll do some prefatory work for the first couple of weeks with normative moral theory. And then the lion's share of the course is dedicated to practical ethics. Now, a question that often comes up is, what's the difference between ethics and morality? And the really simple answer is that there isn't much of one. Morality comes from the Latin more, and ethics comes from the Greek word ethos. They each translate roughly to a community standard, which is just to say, morality and ethics really are two words for the same thing that just come to us from different linguistic roots. One from Latin and one from Greek. But the meaning in Latin and Greek were basically the same. Now, some people have thought, since we have two different words, we can build in a distinction between them. And for people who like to emphasize the distinction, the difference is really just that morality is about the way judgments affect our everyday lives. That is, morality is about the judgments that we make and how they have a practical impact on the lives that we lead. Bernard Williams calls this a thick conception of the good. It's thick in the sense that it has to do with all of the ways that our lives progress, and not one narrow area. The contrast is to think about ethics as a thin concept. Thinking about, or systematic thinking about judgment, rather than making a difference in how our lives actually play out. On this distinction, ethics would be thinking about what counts as right and wrong, independent of how it plays out in our lives. So there's a There's kind of a joke. The ethical man explains to you, or can explain to you, why it's wrong to cheat on his wife. The moral man doesn't cheat on his wife. Right? So one has to do with how you live your life, and the other has to do with understanding values, whether or not they have a practical impact on your life. But at the end of the day, the distinction really is probably overblown. The root of each of these is the same meaning, right? And that is a standard of behavior, a norm. Whether we're talking about morality or ethics, the terms really can be used interchangeably, in the sense that they both just mean a standard of behavior, the way we are supposed to act, as opposed to the way that we maybe do, right? Not all of our behaviors are ideal. So if you want to draw a distinction between morality and ethics, the right way to do it is about practical impact, as opposed to a sort of theoretical understanding. But it's probably not necessary to draw that distinction. Right? So what's the difference between morality and ethics? There isn't one. It's just a linguistic artifact. We happen to have two different words because the English language has Latin and Greek roots. If you want to draw a distinction, it's between thick and thin concepts of behavior. Now, one standard move when we start talking about ethics or morality, whichever term you prefer, is to want to reduce thinking about ethics or morality to thinking about a religious tradition. And for our purposes, this is really not going to work, at least in part, because we are all very likely committed to different religious principles. Some of us will believe God exists, some don't, some believe multiple gods, and some just don't know. So one difficulty in trying to base a moral system on religion is that there's a lot of uncertainty in the first place about whether or not God even exists, never mind what God wants us to do. So there's been a number of arguments proposed to suggest that we ought to believe that God exists, and perhaps the most famous is Pascal's wager. Pascal describes the situation we're in as uncertain. He says we can't be sure that God exists. We can have faith, we can have belief, but having certainty about that is something that's beyond man's capacity. We cannot be sure. All we can do is have faith. So as Pascal describes the situation, he says, well, we have a choice. We could believe in God or not believe in God. And at the same time, perhaps God exists and perhaps God does not. On Pascal's view, how we ought to think about this then is as a bet under conditions of uncertainty. We don't know how it's going to turn out. Maybe God will turn out to exist and maybe God won't. And so as Pascal sees it, he says, well, if you believe in God and it turns out God exists, you win the lottery, right? This is jackpot, eternal reward. And if it turns out God doesn't exist, well, maybe you've wasted some time or some effort. Maybe you've been a little bit better person. Not so bad. On the other hand, if you choose not to believe in God and it turns out God exists, you're stuck with eternal damnation. And if it turns out God doesn't exist, it doesn't really change much for you. So Pascal thinks the situation we're in warrants our believing in God as a good bet. Now, a lot of people, I take it, have exactly that kind of view about religion. I think, well, I might as well go ahead and be religious because maybe it'll end me up in heaven, and what's the downside really? So two things you might want to consider before taking that view. One is that it's very suspicious if God wants you to believe, one presumes that belief should be genuine and not based on a good bet. So the suspicion here is that belief on a bet is somehow less than, or somehow weaker than, somehow less valuable than genuine belief. That is, belief not in an effort to get something for yourself, but belief because you think something happens to be true. Second concern with this style of reasoning to the belief in God is that it doesn't tell us which kind of God to believe in. So it doesn't tell us whether we should follow one holy text or another. It only suggests that following some holy text would be a good bet. The trouble is, there are so many religious traditions from which to choose. It's incredibly uncertain that we would get the right religious tradition, so that even if it were a good bet to believe, this kind of argument makes it very unclear which religion it's a good bet to believe in. And it turns out that most people end up believing in whichever religion they happen to be around. So if you're born in Iran, you're very likely to be Muslim. And if you're born in America, you're very likely to be Christian. And if you're born in India, you're very likely to be Hindu. And so it's very unclear that what's going on here is a system of reasoning that leads one to think, oh, there's a truth in this religious text that stands out from the others. It seems like what's happening more often than not is that people are simply accepting whatever form of religious identity is easiest, whatever's sort of been given to them. And since those three religious traditions are fairly different and call for different types of action in practical circumstances, it's incredibly difficult to believe that a bet on any religious tradition that you happen to be surrounded by is going to be the good bet. Here's an alternative line of argument about religion. If Pascal's wager is an affirmative argument that we ought to believe in God because it's a good bet, the problem of evil is an affirmative argument that we should not believe in God. So the problem of evil presents an argument not just to say there's no evidence of God. Rather, the problem of evil is an affirmative argument to say God, in fact, does not exist or could not exist in a particular sort of form. So while Pascal's wager says we should believe, the problem of evil is an argument that we should not believe. And the argument depends on a particular sort of God. That is, a God that has the three O's, the three traditional O's of the monotheistic religions, being omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. Now, omnipotence is being all-powerful. That is a God that has all power. Omniscience would be a God that is all-knowing. And omnibenevolence is having only good wishes. That is, wishing only well and never evil. Now, the argument is, if a God exists that has both, or has all of these three things, omniscience, that is, knows everything, omnipotence is all-powerful, and omnibenevolence is only good, that there would be no evil in the world. Because a God who knew everything and had the power to change it and was perfectly good would not create evil in the world, or would not allow evil to exist in the world. But evil, it turns out, does exist. And so the argument is, an omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipotent God could not exist because there is in fact evil in the world. Now, there are a couple of ways that somebody might answer that. They might say, well, there in fact is no evil in the world. This is the best of all possible worlds. And a fellow named Pascal made that argument. Right? He argued that, in fact, this is the best of all possible worlds. But that seems unlikely to be true. Another answer is to say, there is a God, but it's something more like the Hindu versions of God. Not an omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipotent God, but rather a God that is in some ways limited. Another alternative, the most popular in the monotheistic religions, is to say that an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God exists, and evil exists in the world, but that evil is caused by man's fall. That is, that having free will, we have created evil in the world for ourselves, and that God did not create it for us. There are two ways you might respond to that if you want to defend the argument of the problem of evil. One is by pointing to natural evil, that is, evil that is not caused by the hands of man. For instance, forest fires are naturally occurring events. When lightning strikes a dried forest bed, fire ensues sometimes. Forest fires happen in other ways as well, but forest fires are natural occurring phenomenon. One of the things that happens in forest fires is that animals burn to death, experiencing great and horrible pain. I take it that pain is bad. And if you think that's evil, then there are some natural evils in the world that seem independent of man's choice. Another response to the claim of people who advocate for free will as a response to the problem of evil is to point out that a God allowing free will to entail the murder of innocents is suspicious. And Dostoevsky makes this point. He describes a situation where during the Russian Revolution, a baby in its mother's arms is skewered with a bayonet and ripped from her arms to hang on the end of a bayonet. He says, okay, this is clearly a situation of evil. Clearly the result of man's free will. But if the only way God could make the world with free will was to allow babies to be bayoneted, he says, that's not a God I can support. That's not a God that's omnibenevolent, or it's not a God that's omniscient, or it's not a God that's omnipotent. Now, whether or not you believe in God is not the point here. Right? The point is just to say, there seem good reasons for and against belief. And there seem good reasons for and against belief in a number of different religious traditions. The trouble is that if we're going to build a moral system, part of the point of having a moral system is to make relationships between people better. And any religious morality we come up with will exclude many, if not most, people. So a secular morality can represent a common bond. That is, some place to get together, a common shared ground on which people of different religious traditions can operate. And the ground of a secular morality has to do with facts and reasons that aren't exclusive to any particular religion. So when you say, my God says so, that's a conversation ender to anybody who believes in a different God. On the other hand, if you present facts and arguments based on those facts that are accessible to anybody no matter what their religion, like suffering is bad, right? Suffering is something that we see as problematic, right? Babies being bayoneted is unfortunate, right? That's something accessible to anybody, no matter their religion. If we can come up with secular things like that, then from there we can get off the ground some procedure for improving relationships between people, even people who have differences or disagreements. So the foundation of a secular morality is one that treats acting on the best answers as important, right? Acting on the best answers derived from facts as important. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't have a religious tradition as well. This doesn't mean that you have to set aside your religious views. What these should do is work together, right? We ought to be able to have, and in fact we do in our regular lives, have secular components of our lives that are supported and dovetailed with our religious traditions. Whether our religious traditions are atheism, agnosticism, Hinduism, Sikhism, Mormonism, what have you. But the idea is that a secular morality can supplement those in a way and cover an area that religious moralities simply cannot. Now, one move, once we decide that having a secular moral system is important, is to say, well, isn't that what the law does? Aren't we, with the law, simply instituting a secular morality? They're saying, okay, this is the set of rules that everybody has to live by, no matter what your religion is. And at some level, absolutely, what we're doing with the legal system is implementing some of the moral beliefs that we hold as a society. And very often these are secular beliefs. Freedom of religion, for instance, right? Whichever religion you prefer, you should be allowed to pursue. That's a secular commitment to support religious tolerance. And an important one. It's an important moral commitment enshrined in the system of law. However, many of our legal codes have either nothing to do with morality, that is, they're simply practical, right? We drive on the right as opposed to the left-hand side of the road. It's a practical rather than a moral matter. And it's worth noting that there are some things in our society that we think are morally wrong, yet we don't make illegal, right? There's a disconnect between morality and the law. They're not identical. So although we use the law to codify and enshrine some of our moral commitments, that's not all that the law does. The law does other things that are more practical as well. And the law doesn't codify or enshrine all of our moral commitments. So there are plenty of moral commitments that are not embodied in the law. And so in a similar way to the game theoretical model that was presented with Pascal's wager, you can see here that if you've got things that are morally good or morally bad actions and things that are legal and illegal, I'm going to get, again, 4 different kinds of options. And it's a bit reductive because some things inhabit a gray area between legal and illegal. And as we discussed before, there are categories beyond simply morally good or morally bad. But in a kind of reduced system here, it's easy to come up with examples of things that are illegal but still morally good. And we can also come up with examples of things that, although they're legal, are morally bad to do. So it's the connection between morality and the law is clear. And very often when we talk about a secular morality, people want to instead of a freestanding secular morality, suppose that secular morality simply is the law. And in some cases, that works, right? Things that are legal and morally good, for instance, charity, courtesy, respect for others, The law leaves plenty of room and even encourages those behaviors because they're morally good. And likewise, the law prohibits some morally bad behaviors, murder, theft, rape. And the idea is those are examples of the law enshrining some moral principles that we take to be true, independent of our religious commitments. On the other hand, there are cases where morality and the law come apart. So for instance, some things that are bad to do are still perfectly legal. So you could walk out into the driveway of your home, to the mall, into the quad at the university, and to people walking by say, "You're going to hell. You're ugly. You're fat. You dress funny." Perfectly legal. All protected by freedom of speech. Incredibly cruel. Right? The kind of thing that is vicious and mean and morally frowned upon. Right? These are morally discouraged, if not prohibited, behaviors. However, they're perfectly legal. Right? Immoral behavior that's legal to do. Likewise, deprivation is perfectly legal. So not feeding large members of our population, perfectly legal. Right? Lots of people are homeless, go hungry, lack medical care. Right? That's morally bad. People starving to death, I take it, is morally bad, and it happens every day. But it happens legally. Likewise, misogyny, racism, right? Although we have some legal prohibitions against discriminating against others on the basis of race or gender when it comes to hiring or firing, whether I want to be a racist or be a misogynist legally is absolutely my choice, right? So hating people of one race or another is legal. Thinking one gender is inferior to the other, perfectly legal, although clearly morally wrong. Likewise, there are some acts, and this is the category that's most challenging with there, because a legal system tends to be fairly minimal. That is, it doesn't tend to delve into private feelings or private behaviors, and only typically regulates public acts. But some things that have been made illegal seem to many to be morally good. So for instance, euthanasia, that is helping people to die quickly who would otherwise die slowly. So if you've ever had a sick cat, or you've had a dog who was dying and sick and in pain, and you took them to the vet and had them put to sleep, that's euthanasia. That's illegal for humans in all but one state. Oregon is the only state in the United States where that's a legal thing to do for a person. So if I'm dying of cancer, it's illegal for a doctor to, at my request, put me to sleep in all states except Oregon. Arguably, and I think a lot of people believe, it's the right thing to do to end somebody's suffering when they're ready to die. But it's illegal. Likewise, if you're starving to death and you steal a loaf of bread, that's illegal. But it seems morally justifiable, at least morally permissible, if not encouraged. It certainly seems permissible. Another thing that imagine also vigilantes. You see a wrong committed, and the law is unable to stop it for one reason or another. Some people advocate the permissibility of vigilante justice in cases like those, but of course they're illegal. So if you like Batman, if you cheer Batman on when he is out there taking down wrongdoers, then you're cheering on an illegal action, a vigilante form of justice that some people argue is morally permissible. The point is just to say, while we shouldn't treat morality and religion as exactly the same thing, right? They can be separated. There's plenty of overlap, but they can be separated. We shouldn't, in the effort to generate a secular moral system, conflate morality with the law, right? Again, there's substantial overlap between morality and the law, but the two things are still separate. And so what we'll be doing in this course is discussing morality. And in some cases there'll be overlap with religion, and in some cases there'll be overlap with the law. But the point is, for the course, what we'll be talking about is secular morality and not the law or religion. Those things will come up and they'll be relevant, but the focus of the course is on morality. Now, the assignment for this half of the week is to go to the discussion board and offer a moral concern. That is, identify some question that you think is morally interesting. So for me, I chose how we ought to raise children. And then I want you to offer actions that you might take in response to say, for me it was child rearing, that you think are morally encouraged. So my example of something being morally encouraged was finding really good schools for your children. Morally encouraged. And then something morally required, feeding your children. Something permissible, watching TV. Discouraged, feeding your kids junk food. And then prohibited, beating your children. So I would like you to go to the discussion board, offer a concern, offer an idea that you think is morally interesting, and then 5 courses of action. 1 morally required, 1 encouraged, 1 permitted, 1 discouraged, and 1 prohibited in response to that moral concern. And then once you've done that, go ahead and take the quiz. I will see you all on Saturday.